It's just coming up to the afternoon, so welcome to everyone who's joined us for today. I don't know where you're sitting, but if you want to put it in the chat pane where you're from and who you are, that would be great. It helps other people in the room to feel, yep, I know where they are, other half of the country. So what we're going to do in a minute, I'm going to start with going through the poll. For those of you who are familiar with our sessions, you can indeed go now. Two ways. You can go to slido.com and you can enter today's code, which is LM220422, or you can use the QR reader. We have 5 questions. Today, we're going to run through the questions, and I'll do that in a minute with people. And we're going to take the answers straight away so that Charles gets an idea of the knowledge and experience in the room. And he says that the answers, if there are answers, to the poll will be given during his presentation. Now, if you have any questions, please put those into the Q&A. They go into one place. The Q&A is on Slido. Now, if that's a question you like, you can vote for it, which means it's a question, it will go up the list. But if you have your own questions, please put it in. You have 2 choices. It can be anonymous if you don't want to own the question, or you can put your name to it. And in terms of feedback, we will be looking at the end of today's session for feedback, which will again be through Slido. So when we get near the end, we'll post it, we'll open that up, and we would appreciate your feedback. Charles particularly has asked feedback, so please let's have it from you. So I think what I'll do is, whilst people are starting to join us, let's put up the poll, please, Abraham, and let's answer the questions. So it's fairly simple. Is your organization committed to achieving net zero by 2050? 2050 seems a long way away. I'm not sure whether I should be patrolling the Earth or not, but is your organization committed to achieving net zero by 2050? Simple yes, no, undecided. When using timber components, do you know where they're sourced from? So the third question, what is your current understanding of responsible timber sourcing and associated certification schemes? So you have 4 choices here: very good, good, limited, or none. 10 people have already answered the polls, completed. Thanks very much. Let's keep going. Do you have any responsible timber sourcing policy within your organization? Do you have a responsible timber sourcing policy within your organization? Yes, no, unsure. And the last one, what is your current understanding of the chain of custody process for timber certification? Choice here of very good, good, limited, or none. So if you could kindly send those answers in, that would be great. I'll just give it a couple more minutes, Charles, just for people to complete it, to see if we can get some more. No if you're still trying to get in, remember you can go to Slido one of 2 ways: by going to slido.com and entering today's code LM220422, or you can use the QR reader. I think we have 16 people or so, which is, you know, lowish, but I think it'll give us a start. So you can carry on answering the questionnaire as we go through. Don't worry, you'll see that as we go through the answers, anyone who puts in an answer, it will change as we go through. So Abraham, can we put up the results? Is your organization committed to achieving net zero by 2050? Interestingly, the majority of the room, by far the majority, nearly 90%, say yes. So I suspect, Charles, it's probably what you would like to hear.
Yeah, that sounds good. That sounds good.
We probably have one person who's undecided. So let's have the next one, please, then, Abraham. When using timber components, do you know where they are sourced from? Slightly less. Majority say yes. 33 unsure. I'm sure Charles will cover this. Oh, we just slipped up. Yep. 58. Great. Someone else answered. Okay, number 3, please. What is your current understanding of responsible timber sourcing and associated certification schemes? Limited, good, very good, and none. Well, that's interesting, Charles. So I suspect they're going to learn an awful lot from you today.
Hopefully, sounds good.
Would you have expected that?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Do you have a responsible timber sourcing policy within your organization? 50% say yes. So we've got no and unsure. So it's a 50-50 answer. Is that again what you would sort of expect, Charles?
I would have expected higher to say yes, but
Oh,
there we
right.
go.
Okay.
But that we will go through that as well, which is good. So we'll look
Yeah.
at possible policies they might want to use. And
lastly, what is your current understanding of the chain of custody process for timber certification? 60% say their understanding is limited, only 20% say good, whereas 15% say none, and only 5% say very good. So majority of the room have a very limited understanding, Charles.
Yeah, that's understandable as well. So we'll definitely be going through that in a bit of detail later on. So that's good. Good to hear. Good.
Okay, thank you everyone for the poll. I'm now going to hand over to Charles, and let me remind you, if you do have any questions for him, please post them into the Slido Q&A, and I'll make sure that Charles answers these towards the end of his presentation. So, Charles, over to you. Many thanks.
Lovely. Okay, let's get the screen up. There we go. Hopefully you can all see my screen now, which is good. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming along today to this Constructing Excellence webinar. It's good to meet you all. My name's Charlie Law, like Howard has said. My background is very much construction. I've spent nearly 35 years in the construction industry. 12 years of those were heading up environmental management at one of the larger construction organizations. I'm now a freelance consultant, have been doing that for the last 7 years, very much looking at things like timber, circular economy, and the like, resource efficiency and responsible sourcing, all of those types of things as part of my work there. We're here today, we're going to be talking about responsible timber sourcing, as you know. So we're going to be looking at some of the schemes that are involved with that. Just to let you know, this session is sponsored by PEFC, we're one of the certifying organisations, but we will be talking about all of the certification bodies and systems that are out there that you can use. So today we're going to cover, why do we touch on why we need forest certification, look a little bit at the timber market and sources, because that's quite important when you look at the certification side of things. Look at CPET and the approved certification schemes, the differences between those schemes, some of the drivers for certification, inclusive specification clauses, and the chain of custody process. And we'll touch on maybe project certification at the end if we get time, but we might not get time for that today. And hopefully by the end of that, you'll have a better understanding of that. Just so you know, I know the different certification schemes. This scheme is also being approved by the CPD certification service, as well as the scheme that's Construction Excellence Lose. So why do we need forest certification? Well, we have to spend time on this. I think we've all seen some of these pictures in the press of deforestation and issues around plantations and sort of the one on the right there is actually where they took the forest out and planted some coffee crops, and that destabilized the hillside and killed a load of people. So there's lots of issues around that, and people being able to use that forest for its original use, for food, for fire, for, heat and everything else, and not being able to do that now. And obviously a lot of that is down to the deforestation that's happening. Now, that has reduced. These are the latest figures from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And back in the 90s, we was losing sort of 7.8 million hectares of forest every year. That has slowed. We're still losing too much, around 4.7 million hectares a year. And this is a slightly older map, but shows you the hotspots of where the problems are. And these haven't changed too much over the years. Brazil is still losing over 1 million hectares a year. It's something like 3.5 football pitches every minute. But South America, most parts of Africa and parts of the Far East are really very much the hotspots on deforestation. Compare that with the northern hemisphere. Most of Europe, North America, Russia is in a state of reforestation or a state of flux. Places like China, and I think when you see an updated map when it does come out from the FOA, we'll see places like India and Pakistan really growing their forest cover as well. And like I say, forest timber, the use of timber, when it's done sustainably, is very good for the environment. We talked about those net zero plans. If you're looking to reduce the carbon footprint or embodied carbon within your building, timber is a very good way of doing that. And most of it will come from plantations like this on the left. This is a typical forest. This is where it's been thinned at partway through the forest cycle, and that timber that's on the floor there will probably go into lower grade uses like fencing and panel boards. We're leaving the trees that are left to go to maturity, and that's the stuff that we're used in buildings and this is in the UK, so it'd be sort of C16 timber that goes into forest, goes into your buildings. On the right, hardwoods, slightly different process there. They are what we call selectively felled, and they just take out an amount of timber that forest can sustain over its lifetime and no more. So there's always continuous cover within that forestry. And just to show you, obviously where we get a lot of our timber from, I'll show you a bit more detail on this in the graphs in a second. But the Baltic states and Scandinavia is where we get a lot of our timber from nowadays. So the softwood timber that we use for building, and you'll see these pictures on this here will show over a 12-year period, Sweden and Finland there's particularly, you can see that what came out on the left in the red and what's gone back in the purple on the right is very aligned. There's not much that hasn't regrown from what's been taken out, and there will be a little bit of a lag with this. And you look at the UK, very similar, a lot less forest cover obviously and a lot less trees being taken out, but you can see there's a good correlation between what's come out and what's gone back in those pictures there. But you compare that, we mentioned Brazil. This is where we see the issues. Brazil, a lot coming out, very little going back in as forestry. The only country really that can be classed as sustainable in South America is Chile. And so looking at the timber market, it's quite important really how the market works in the UK and where we get our timber from and what we're using, because that really dictates on what we should be focusing our efforts on when looking at sustainable timber. So looking at this, you've got UK timber consumption in the UK is generally around 17 million. These are the figures for 2020, obviously the pandemic year, so the figures were slightly lower. But the split is very similar to what you'll see in normal years. So very much the majority of the timber that we use is softwood, coming from those plantations that we saw in that picture earlier on, and also softwood products as well. So things like the particle board there and OSB and your fiber boards and MDFs are all made from that softwood forest product. You've then got some sawn hardwood there in the dark brown and your plywoods in the top, and the plywoods are generally hardwood plies. So yeah, that's generally the split of the timber products that we use. These figures at the moment don't include CLT and glulam because these are based on the import data, and there isn't actually a code for CLT and glulam at the moment, or it's only just come in and they're not in these figures at the moment. But just to give you an idea that CLT and glulam is probably less than 1% of all this timber that came in. So it's around 150 to 200,000 cubic meters of CO2 and glulam that comes into the UK each year. So it's and that would form part of that softwood element anyway. But just where we get our timber from, we need to look at where the risks really and the legality side of things. And we can see that the legality risk for timber, when you start importing from further afield, it can get quite high. So generally okay for Europe and North America, although there are some pockets where you might need to be careful. But when you start looking at places like South America, the Far East and Russia, there are some big issues there around the legality of the timber from those areas, which we need to consider when we're purchasing or procuring timber for our projects. And this is the breakdown of where all the timber comes from. So some people are quite surprised that the UK actually supplies quite a bit of timber into the construction market. Others think, well, that's very low. So it's always a bit of a mismatch on what people's perceptions are. But actually, these are the figures. So a little over a third of the timber that we get in the UK is sourced from homegrown sources. The vast majority of the main is coming from the EU, so that's fairly low risk sources there. But you do start to see some of the high risk areas coming in for the rest of the sourcing. So China, Russia, Brazil that we've mentioned before, Malaysia, Indonesia. You start to see some issues there. And like say, you start looking at Russia there, we had over 500,000 cubic meters of timber coming from Russia in 2020. That has now stopped dead from Russia and Belarus. So that is no longer coming into the UK. So there's obviously a gap there that needs to be filled by the other nations. And that's not just for the UK, that's obviously all of Europe and other parts of the world that need to fill that gap. So hence some of the issues with supply that you might be seeing with certain products at the moment, particularly around things like Siberian larch and birch plies. So just to give you an idea on a breakdown of the homegrown supply there, obviously a lot of softwood comes from the UK, but the vast majority of that is from the EU. Hardwoods, very much from the temperate hardwoods coming from the EU, USA and Canada. The tropical hardwoods are the risky bits that we need to focus on there. Particle boards and OSBs, very much homegrown sources, with the majority coming from the EU, a lot of that coming from Ireland. Similarly with your MDFs and fibre boards, fairly low risk there, although there was a growing percentage coming from Russia, which will no longer come from Russia, no doubt. But obviously that might get picked up by China. But it's plywoods where we have the biggest risk, I think. So you can see we don't make any of that in the UK at the moment. The percentage that we get from the EU has been falling for the last few years that I've been doing these presentations. That was up at over 20% at one time. It's now down to 16%. And all of those are coming from fairly, higher risk nations. So if you're going to look at one thing on your projects, from the responsible sourcing side of things, have a look at the plywoods and where you might want to try and maybe look at the sourcing them, or even looking at substitute products. Maybe an OSB instead of a plywood might be a more sustainable solution going forward. So central point of expertise. So this is it really starts to look at what we should be looking at from a responsible sourcing side of things. And the central point of expertise was set up in 2004 by the UK government because of some high profile incidents that they had with timber sourcing, which I'll show you in a second. But they came up with this requirement of two forms of evidence that you could use to prove that your timber that you was using on their projects was legal and sustainable. The first source of evidence, and these are both the same, there's no hierarchy here, it's one or the other, was the first source of evidence was independent forest certification schemes. Now the key ones there are Programme for the Endorsement of Forest Certification, PEFC, and the Forest Stewardship Council, FSC. So that was category A evidence, and in category B evidence was all other forms of evidence. So it could be that you got your timber from a UK forestry standard source. That's now been proved by what we call the Grown in Britain standard, and it's likely that the next iteration of the CPEC guidance will see Grown in Britain added to that independent forest certification schemes going forward. You then got things like FLEGT, the Forest Law Enforcement Governance and Trade, which I'll touch on in a second. Or if you haven't got those forms of evidence, you would need to go through what they call the compliance framework for evaluating category B evidence. Now, you really don't want to be looking at that, because that means you have to delve into the source of your timber. Is it a low risk country? If it's not a low risk country, you need to go all the way back to the forest to figure out whether that timber was harvested legally and sustainably. And if you're looking at something like, we mentioned plywood earlier on, where that could be coming from a number of different forest locations, that is a really difficult task. You really want to stay away from that at all costs. This slide, I won't touch on it, but it just shows that near enough all the schemes there, PFC, FSC, GRB, do ensure legal and sustainability and forest sustainability. The key one there that has a bit of a problem is the FLEGT. It's a licensing scheme. At the moment, there's only one country that has a license to import FLEGT timber. That's Indonesia. And the key issue is that it doesn't have what we call this chain of custody process, and we'll go into a bit more information on chain of custody later on, but it basically tracks the timber from the forest all the way to the site of use. And FLEGT doesn't do that. It only tracks it to the port of import. So there is a gap between the port of import and your site. So it's generally why you won't see that on construction sites. So we'll ignore that one at the moment going forward. So the three key schemes that you're likely to see turn up on a construction site are PFC, FSC and Grown in Britain. There are some differences between these schemes. So PFC is very much an umbrella scheme. It oversees the independent forest certification schemes of a number of countries. For example, CSA is Canada, Responsible Wood is Australia, MTCC is Malaysia, SFI covers North America and Canada, and UCWAS, the UK Woodland Assurance Standard. So they are sort of independent forest certification schemes within the individual countries. And what happens is PFC will endorse those. They make an application to PFC, tell them what they're all about, and the PFC will endorse them if they meet the PFC requirements, sustainability benchmarks. FSC is slightly different because it's very much a top-down approach, and you've got the FSC principles and criteria, which then get developed into a national standard. And that's what the forest needs to be managed to. Just out of interest, UCWAS is the FSC national standard for the UK. So UCWAS actually covers both PFC and FSC schemes. So if you've got an UCWAS certified forest, that forest can be certified to PFC or FSC. And also actually grown in Britain. Grown in Britain is slightly different. Because we've got the UK forestry standard in the UK, which is the legal requirement, so it's separate from UCWAS. We have this legal requirement called the UK forestry standard. Basically, Grown in Britain takes that and says, yes, if you're working to that UK forestry standard, which was, if you remember, was part of CPET, then you can get a Grown in Britain license for your certification for your forest, and then Grown in Britain will track that timber through the supply chain to your site as well in a similar way to the other schemes. So that's the slight differences between the schemes, but they all basically mean that the timber that's turning up on your site, if they've got this FSC or PFC or Grown in Britain logo on them, then they will be from a legal and sustainable source. And just to give you an idea of the coverage of the schemes and the dominant scheme within each area, because a lot of people sort of heard of FSC, but actually the larger scheme is PEFC. And if you look at sort of North America and Europe, most of the timber coming out of those areas is covered by one of the PEFC schemes. There are some areas that are dual certified, like the UK and Sweden, but the majority of the timber, coming from the local sources, you could say, is PEFC. FSC does a very good job in certain parts of the world where they haven't got that governance and they haven't got those management standards in place. So places like South America, Africa, parts of the Far East, where they haven't got a forest standard in place, FSC can go in and certify individual forest plots, which means that you can get your sustainable timber from those areas. So each scheme has its merits. So the drivers for certification. Obviously, one of the big ones was that UK government's timber procurement policy. And basically, the UK government policy states that only timber will derive products originating from independently verified legal and sustainable sources, which can include FLEGT, will be demanded for use on the government estate. And you must have appropriate documentation to prove that. And we've talked about what that might be, certification schemes or FLEGT licenses. And it applies to all virgin timber and wood derived products used on the government estate. So that would include your temporary works, so things like hoardings, protection material, and the likes, formwork for concrete, all would fall into that category. And if you need a link, I'll send some PDF around to Abraham to send around to you. But that link to that government policy is there if you need it. Linked to that, you've got the UK timber regulation. This was the EU TR, the EU timber regulation. It's now just applies to this bit. Just applies to the UK. It's obviously almost identical to the European legislation. The only issue now is that all European timber now falls under the UK TR. So anything coming from Scandinavia, they have to, or for example, would need to have some due diligence with it to ensure that it was legal. This doesn't cover sustainability. This legislation is very much around legality, and it defines two types of organisation: an operator and a trader. So operators are very much your timber importers, but your traders would include people like the contractors. So it means they have to know where they're getting their timber from. And so if you're an architect or an engineer and you want to check where the timber for your building has come from, your contractor should be able to tell you as part of this legislation. We've obviously got drivers around CO2. We mentioned net zero, and we've got the things like the Climate Assembly for the UK saying that we should avoid using high emission materials, e.g. buildings could use more timber than cement. So there's some key issues there. And obviously how we measure that in embodied carbon assessments. And Timber Development UK We helped them actually write this document, which is how embodied carbon technical paper on assessing the carbon-related impacts and benefits of timber in construction products and buildings. So some good documents there if you need some more information on how carbon is accounted within timber products and buildings. Other drivers, obviously, the certification schemes, so BREEAM, LEED, and SCAR. And obviously the UN Sustainable Development Goals. A lot of companies are adopting these and saying, well, and obviously life on land is a key one there that will drive certified timber. But it's not just that life on land that these, particularly the PFC and FSC schemes, will look at. You know, they do make sure that there's good health and well-being for the workers, that they're paid well, that they've got decent work and economic growth in the areas, that clean water and sanitation is provided for them. So they impact on a lot more areas than just that life on land piece. And obviously we talked about reputation, and these are some of the pictures that show, you know, so the Home Office in 2003, DEFRA office in 2005, and in 2006. One of my projects actually was the Kelvingrove Art Gallery in 2003, where they got Greenpeace actually occupied the site because they suspected there was illegal timber. I can confirm that my site didn't have illegal timber on it, but the key issue was we hadn't asked for sustainable timber on the project. It was pure luck that we'd actually bought sustainable timber. So that leads us into the next bit. What should we be actually asking for when we specify timber for a construction project? And for me, there's 5 key areas that we need to look at. We need to reference timber and other wood-based products. So it's not just timber we need to think of, other wood-based products that might be incorporated. So things like your MDFs, which are, you know, a composite product made of timber, should be included in that definition. It should include the scope of the work, so temporary as well as your permanent work. So it includes those formworks, and etc. Reference the UK government central point of expertise, where if you're working in the UK, use that reference, because that is a good definition of what legal and sustainable is. Make sure you include a requirement for chain of custody to the site of use. That is a key bit sometimes missing. You want to make sure that that timber reaches the site of use and you can check it when it reaches your site. And where you can, include examples of the schemes that meet the above criteria. So an example, which I say we'll send it around with the slides, is the following example of the include specification clause. So you've got all timber, and this covers all those bits. All timber and wood-based products for either temporary or permanent inclusion in the works must be from legal and sustainable sources as defined by the UK government central point of expertise on timber, and be delivered to site with full chain of custody. And like I say, so that's the key bit. And if you can state the bit, the certification schemes, the chain of custody certification schemes recognised as meeting the above include PFC, FSC, and Groningen Britain. So that's all you'd need in your specifications if you wanted to make sure that your timber was from a legal and sustainable source. If you use things like the NBS course system, you know, online specifications, we've done a lot of work with NBS to make sure their specifications meet those requirements as well. So that's all included within there. Schemes. And just some examples, you know, this is one of the larger contractors, BAM, gives you their some of their wording from their sustainability report from a few years ago. So we've talked about chain of custody a lot, but what do we mean by chain of custody and how does it work? So chain of custody, I'll give you the definition. Chain of custody certification is a mechanism for tracking certified material from the forest to the final product to ensure that the wood fibre or non-wood forest material contained in the product or product line can be traced back to a certified forest. So that's the definition. That's actually a PFC definition. But what do we mean by that in practice? So what does that mean? So we've got our forest. Now, for example, this is our UK forest, and it's certified to UCWAS, so the UK Woodland Assurance Standard that we mentioned earlier on. So that means any timber coming out of that forest can actually be certified as PEFC, FSC, or grown in Britain. So, you know, you can take your choice on those ones. And actually, on the chain of custody side, it can actually be certified to all 3 now on the delivery ticket to the next person in the chain. So that next person in the chain is generally the sawmill. So the sawmill will need to then have its own what we call chain of custody certification. So the UCWAS is the forest certification. The sawmill has a chain of custody certification. Now, if it wants to pass on the claims those claims of PFC, FSC, and or grown in Britain, it must be certified to one or all of those schemes that it wants to pass on. So in this case, this, like I say, the sawmill might be certified to PFC, FSC, and grown in Britain standards, and that means it can pass the claim for that sawn timber on to the next person in the chain, maybe the merchant, so Travis Perkins or an Arnold Laver or someone along those lines. And again, if they want to pass those claims on to their customers, i.e. the construction company, they would need to be certified against the relevant schemes that they want to pass on. So in this case, PFC, FSC, grown in Britain. And they will deliver the material into site. Now, the site itself does not need to be certified. Okay, so the contractor itself does not need to be certified unless they are bringing material onto the site themselves. So if the material is delivered directly to the construction site, the contractor managing that site does not need to be certified. They can, however, go for project certification, and like I say, we'll try and touch on that at the end, what that means. Now, that's a very simple supply chain, and there's obviously going to be lots of areas where you might get manufacturers involved that might be taking timber from sawmills or from merchants, manufacturing a product and then deliver that in the site. And again, anyone that's handling that material, delivering a product into a construction site will need to be certified to one of the schemes. Now, the issue comes when we've got, when a company doesn't have all those certification schemes. So, for example, our manufacturer might only use PEFC certified products of timber, for example, which means that he might only need to certify his product to PEFC. So he might not bother with FSC and grown in Britain because there's no point. If all the material he buys is PEFC, then he might as well just certify himself to PEFC. Likewise, our merchant might not buy any PEFC material, unlikely, but he may not. So he might just certify himself as FSC or grown in Britain. Now, as long as we've got that open policy that we mentioned earlier on that includes all three schemes, it doesn't really matter because that means, you're always going to get certified to material into your project. It's where you start maybe restricting that supply and say, right, we are, some companies we know will say, well, we only want FSC material. If that was the case, then you wouldn't be able to buy that product from the manufacturer there because their certification is PEFC. So very much encourage you to have an open certification scheme. The other issue we get is where obviously we don't get any certification. So although certified material might be used in the manufacture of a product, if that final product is bought to site by someone who hasn't got that chain of custody registration scheme, we then have what we call that broken chain of custody. We used to see this a lot with formwork contractors where they'd have timber delivered to their yard and then they'd bring bits into the construction site. And if they weren't certified themselves to one of those schemes, then we would have that broken chain of custody situation. So that's something you just need to keep an eye on site. Now, that broken chain of custody, however, might be further down the supply chain. So, for example, if the sawmill wasn't certified, they could still supply material into those two organizations that are chain of custody certified. Just because they've got chain of custody certification doesn't mean they always have to supply chain of custody material. So what would happen is they could still supply that material to your site, it just wouldn't have a chain of custody claim against it. And that's something you need to keep an eye on, and we'll talk about what to look out for on delivery tickets in a minute. So it's very important you don't just go to, you don't just rely on the person supplying you being certified. You need to look at the delivery tickets as well. So we'll look at both areas now. So the first thing we'll look at is the chain of custody certificate. So what should your supplier have in place to be able to supply you with certified to material? So this is an example for Arnold Laver. This is online on their website. This is their PEFC certificate. So what it shows is obviously their name. It's got their head office address, the scope of material they can provide, and the type of products. And it will also have things like certificate numbers, expiry dates, and where they've got more than one depot, so obviously merchants will have more than one depot, it will have an appendix that will list all the sites that are certified. Okay, and we'll just highlighted one there, New Road in Rainham, because that ties in with the delivery ticket we're going to look at in a minute. So you've got to make sure that initially your supplier has that certificate to be able to supply you with certified timber. Now you can check this online. You can do different searches for your products, find more info. And the good thing about the online side is that it does tell you whether the status of that certificate. Obviously certificates are issued for a 5-year period, but during that period, they will be audited annually. So if there is a problem, then the license may be suspended or the certificate may be suspended. So the website will actually tell you this. Obviously, on this case, Arnold Laver, their status there is stated as valid. And you've got the links to all different sites there to be able to check that. But obviously, once the material gets to site, you've got all labels and bits and pieces on the product to say it's, you know, FSC or PEFC or grown in Britain, but they get ripped off and the material gets sawn up, and you won't see those. And so what is your evidence that that timber that's actually delivered was actually from a sustainable source? And that's where your delivery note comes in. So this is our Arnold Laver delivery note, and the sort of information we need to be checking on this is it's applied from a certified depot on the certificate, and that is the New Road in Rainham one that we highlighted in the certificate. So we know it's coming from an audited source. You need to make sure that it's delivered to your site. So, you know, for this case, it's the main contractor for a new superstore. So make sure it's delivered to your site, not to your subcontractor or supplier's address. Make sure it's delivered to the delivery address is your site. That means you've got that full chain of custody. Make sure obviously the date is within the validity of the certificate that you've got. Make sure there's a correct product claim, and we'll talk about product claims in a second. And the chain of custody certificate number is somewhere on that delivery ticket. Most of the time it's in a side box or somewhere now, and preferably some form of quantity so you can calculate your percentage of material from the different schemes. Now, there are a number of checklists that you can get hold of that help you with this process. The top one there is the PEFC one. If we was doing this in person, we'd have some copies of those for you. If you do want those, if you email info@pefc.org, they will be able to send some of those over to you. So we talked about claims, and there are lots of different claims that could appear on your delivery ticket. Luckily, these are all the claims that might appear, but luckily the only ones you need to worry about are these ones. So for PEFC, you'll see 100% PEFC origin, which means all the materials come from PEFC source, or you'll see a percentage claim. Now, we'll talk about the percentage claims in a second, what they mean, but you know, in most cases, it will be a minimum of 70% because that is the minimum percentage required by CPET. And I'll explain what they mean in a second. Similarly, FSC, you'll have an FSC 100% or an FSC mix, and again, that FSC mix should be a minimum of 70%. FSC will also have a recycled percentage as well. GIB is slightly different. It has two different claims, main claims: forest product, which means that products come straight from the forest, or you have what we call a GIB sourced, which means it coming from maybe different sources, from say a sawmill that's brought a number of sources together into a product. So you'll have two different claims on there, but all are from legal and sustainable. So just on those claims, obviously the first one where we've got 100% PEFC origin, and that could quite easily be FSC 100% as well. It means that all of the product, all the material in that product has come from an FSC or PEFC source, depending on what the claim is. So in this case, all of that product for that would have come from a PEFC forest. So nice and easy. Now, the problem is that sawmills will source material from a number of different forests. And it may be that some of those forests aren't, in this case, AQUAS, and wouldn't be able to certify as PEFC material, for example. Some of that material may come from a UK forestry standard source, not an AQUAS source. And what happens there is they're allowed to mix that in the sawmill as long as they've done the due diligence on that forest. So the sawmill would have had to check the source, make sure it's a legal and sustainable source, make sure in this case it's managed in accordance with the UK forestry standard. It could then allow that material in the mix at the sawmill. And what would happen, it would come out at the end with that 70% PEFC certified label. Now, it doesn't mean that only 7% is legal and sustainable. All of that material, as you can see, because it's been managed in accordance with UKFS, all of it is legal and sustainable timber. It just means that only 70% of it, or whatever percentage on there, has come from that PEFC source. Okay. Similarly, so that's for sawn product. You might get a manufactured product. In this case, maybe an example might be a door. And the door will have different materials. It's going to have a chipboard core possibly, and then it might have veneers and lip-ins that are hardwood, and they likely come from different sources. So, for example, our chipboard core might make up the bulk of the product, bulk of the volume, and that might be an FSC board. And our lip-ins and veneers might come from a PEFC source. Now, they will come into that factory at the end there. That product will be made, and that factory will make the decision based on the amount of material in the product. Will then be able to decide which claim it makes. And in this case, obviously, because more than 70% of the material came from an FSC source, it gives it an FSC mixed 70% claim. But as you can see, the other 30% came from a PEFC source. So again, all legal and sustainable timber. It's just that 70% of it came from FSC. So that's why it's got that mix. So wherever you see those labels, whether it's 100%, 70% PFC, FSC mixed 70%, it still means that all of that timber is quite is all legal and sustainable. No problems at all with it. So don't get too hung up by the percentages. We'll quickly touch on project certification. We've got another 4 or 5 minutes left. And just the project certification requirements, you've got two main schemes offer project certification, so PFC and FSC. Key difference is that FSC require a minimum of 50% of the material to be from FSC sources. So there's quite a quite strict requirement there. The remainder of the wood must come from what we call FSC controlled wood or other reclaimed sources. Now, if you're going for FSC controlled wood, that is quite difficult. That is similar to what we talked about earlier on with under the CPAT schemes. It means you will have to go back into the forest in some cases to check that forest is managed legally and sustainable in accordance with the FSC rules. And that can be difficult and time consuming. So now, the other thing is that FSC do not recognize PEFC certified material. So even though that material that you brought onto the project might be PEFC certified, FSC will consider that as uncertified material, and you will need to go back to the forest to check it, even if it's PEFC. So it's very strict on that side with FSC, which does mean that will put a lot of restrictions on your on what you can buy for your project. PFC, on the other hand, there isn't a minimum percentage of PFC material required, and the due diligence system still means that you have to check that all the other material coming in is from a legal and sustainable source, but they will recognise FSC material. So if you've got timber coming into your project which is FSC certified, PEFC will deem that as good due diligence, and they can accept that as part of the legal and sustainable timber. So it's quite different approaches there when it comes to other certified material. Now, if you can't get all the material from one particular source or in accordance with the project certification requirements, you can go for what they call parcel certification. So you might say, well, all of our doors or all the flooring or the timber frame is certified, and as long as you get over the certain percentage, so in both cases 70%, it allows you to use the trademark of the particular organization, and both will issue a certificate which will say what materials in there. So like I say, quite different. The due diligence required for those teams vary considerably, so be very careful if you specify project certification on your project. And that's really us. So a couple of projects there that were certified to the different standards. So Olympic Park was actually dual certified to both FSC and PFC. Main reason I think it got dual certification was most of the material in there was near enough all of it actually was FSC material, so that was the only reason it got dual certified. King's Gate House, that was actually the first PEFC certified project, and the key reason for that is that it was a CLT building, and all the material came from I believe it came from Austria, which very much has only PEFC certified forests, so hence why they went for the PEFC project certification in that case. So that's really the presentation. Happy to take your questions, but before that, just a little bit of a call to actions. Hopefully, we hope you now have a bit of a better understanding of responsible timber sourcing, and ask you to take some actions and some takeaways away with you. So ensure responsible timber procurement is on your sustainability agenda. Make sure that that's a key focus when you're looking at timber and timber buildings. Consider what timber you specify and where this may be sourced from. So we talked there about our plywoods and how plywoods are very high risk, and if you haven't got that certification in place, you could come a cropper there by using plywoods from uncertified sources. So also consider, are there other materials that you could use? Could you use an OSB in place of a plywood? Much lower risk because it's likely to come from the UK or very close to the UK, Europe definitely. So could you use a different material? We talked about things like the Russia situation, where you're going to have problems getting Siberian larch, which is very much used as a cladding material. Could you use other cladding materials? You know, there are things like thermally modified timbers now. There's one, for example, called Brimstone, which is a Grown in Britain certified product, which takes underutilized timbers like ash and poplar, which would normally go to firewood in the UK. It thermally modifies those, makes them durable, which means they can use externally on the building. So look at other alternatives to maybe your usual specification if you are using Siberian larch at the moment, for example. Ensure whatever you specify, that you specify a timber certification scheme that meets the CPET requirements. And like I say, at the moment, the easiest ones to go for are PFC, FSC, and Grown in Britain. And make sure that your timber is delivered to the project with full chain of custody. So check those delivery tickets. If you're visiting site, ask the contractor to see the delivery tickets for certain products. Like I say, particularly plywood. If you know plywood is being used, ask to see a plywood delivery ticket. And make sure it has got one of those claims on it that we discussed there earlier on. I won't dwell on that. That is our feedback form there that we usually use, but I think, like I say, we've got your own feedback there from Howard, so we'll skip that, and happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Charles. We've got some questions, so indeed, let's put them up. So if you can stop sharing your screen, Charles, yep, that'd be super. Okay, Abraham, let's take the first question. So I can read it out whilst it's coming up. Will it be easy to replace the now lost supply of timber from Russia? And I think there's another question, but probably linked to Russia. How is the Ukraine conflict impacting the timber market?
Okay, so yes, so obviously it's not going to be easy to replace the lost timber supplies from Russia. You know, for example, we mentioned Siberian larch and birch plywoods. The vast majority of the birch plywood, for example, that we use in the UK came from Russia and Belarus. So that supply has been cut off. So it's not going to be easy to find new sources for that, and it will take time to find some of those new sources. So we will have to look in those cases for alternative products. And I know, for example, Timber Development UK have got people looking at this and seeing if there are alternative plywood sources that could be used that would meet the specification. And you know, and everyone's having this problem. For example, Marshall amplifiers, for example, use birch plywood because of its acoustic properties, so not just because it's a good quality plywood, because of its acoustic properties. They need to now find a different source for their amplifiers because of that issue. So I know it's not going to be easy. In the UK, our reliance on Russian timber was relatively small. So, as you said there, it was less than 5% of our timber comes from Russia and Belarus. That 550,000 cubic meters that we saw there. The problem is that Europe as a whole, around 10% of Europe's timber as a whole came from Russia and Belarus. And obviously they're going to be looking for other sources for that timber, which will impact the UK market, because obviously where we normally go for our timber now, other people are going to be going for that timber as well. So you're going to see you are going to see more restrictions in certain products going forward. So it's going to cause issues. I know, like I say, the industry bodies like Timber Development UK are looking very close at this, and if you need advice on that, they're probably the best people to contact for alternative sources.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. So let's have the next question up, please, Abraham. Is there a circular economy in timber? And if so, how does certification figure in its reuse? I'm actually very interested when you mentioned it right at the beginning, circular economy, because it's not something that we've actually talked an awful lot about in these webinars. And it's obviously going to be a real growing area with people looking at sustainability and all the issues around it.
Absolutely. Well, yes, there is a circular economy in timber, and we are doing a presentation on the 20th of May on this, actually. So I'm coming back on the 20th of May to talk specifically about timber and the circular economy. So make sure you sign up to that one. Yes, there is a circular economy. There's lots of things we can do. Like I say, there's probably not enough time to go through them all today. So the best thing is really very much to sign up to that circular economy presentation on the 20th of May, and we can go through the different aspects, because it's very much around trying to make that timber last longer, looking at things like durability, and then looking at how certain products could be taken back and reused. And I actually heard I took in a meeting the other day that one of the big CLT suppliers in the UK will actually now take back that product at end of life and for reuse. So there are schemes coming on board with circular economy. So absolutely there is. And if you want more detail, come along on the 20th of May.
What a perfect advert, Charles. Well done. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Great. I'm not sure if that was Abraham's question, was it? No.
No. Unfortunately, we don't know who it is. It is anonymous. So
there we go. But thank you very much. Yeah, come along on the 20th of May.
So let's have the next question, please, Abraham. How can I have real certainty that fabricated timber products such as plywood manufactured in China truly satisfy requirements of legality and sustainability?
Right, from China, very much you've got to be looking for that FSC or PEFC logo and a chain of custody on your delivery ticket. If that isn't on the delivery ticket, if it doesn't say FSC or PEFC on that delivery ticket underneath that product item, now it must be against the product line. It can't just be somewhere on the delivery ticket. It must be against that product item. Then you cannot be sure that that is from a legal and sustainable source. So the key thing is to make sure you look out for that PEFC or FSC claim on that delivery ticket against the plywood that you've bought. That is really the only way you can really check it.
Okay, thanks. It probably links with the next question. So if we have that, because this is a question, does rogue timber still get into the system? So in other words, yes, there's a paper certificate, but I mean, a lot of timber is stamped, etc. Is it possible for rogue timber still to get into the system?
There isn't any perfect system, there are still unscrupulous people out there that will try and abuse the system. The key thing is that obviously these schemes are carrying out audits on a regular basis within all these countries around the world against the forest management system, and where they do highlight problems, they will suspend those licenses, and hence why it's very, very much a requirement that you check on the website of your supplier to make sure that their certificate is still valid. Because there will be problems, there will be issues. I say no system is perfect. I think the way you've got to look at it is that the vast majority of the timber that's coming onto site from these certification schemes, FSC, PEFC, grown in Britain, is being done in the right way. It's just those few odd, unscrupulous suppliers that will ruin the system for everyone else. So yes, we can't say it's 100% faultless, but what we can say is it's probably I wouldn't like to put a figure on it, but it's going to be very high. I'd like to say it's over 99%, but I couldn't give you a figure on that because they're not published. But there is a slight chance that rogue timber will get into the system. The key thing is, if you didn't look for FSC or PEFC, you've got a much higher chance of that rogue timber being in the system. So, at least if you're specifying FSC, PEFC grown in Britain, you've got a much lower chance of that rogue timber appearing on your site.
So two sort of questions spring to my mind here. Someone's prompted me. How about the certification of recycled timber? Is that a yes or no? So do you get a certificate with recycled timber?
FSC, you can get FSC recycled, yes. So if you're manufacturing, for example, a chipboard that's made up of recycled components within that chipboard, then yes, you can get that FSC recycled claim against the item on the delivery ticket. So that will give you a lot more confidence in there. If you're looking at recycled or reused timber, that is a little bit more difficult. The certification schemes don't generally cover reused timber. So if you're taking reclaimed timber out of a building and using that on site, the certification schemes don't cover that at the moment. That's not to say they won't in the future. That's something they might be looking at going forward on the circular economy side. But in that situation, you really just need to make sure that you've got good provenance of that reclaimed timber. You know where it's come from. You've got photographs of that timber being taken out and coming onto your site. So that's really how you should process that in that situation for reused timber.
I mean, just thinking of the road traders, I know it's a sort of probably not a real area of concern here, but if Auntie Mary's getting a nice wooden timber extension to her house, how would she know that she's getting timber that's been properly sourced? She asks the builder to show.
Ask the builder to show the delivery tickets, and the delivery ticket should have her address on it, and it should state that the timber is FSC or PEFC against each item of timber.
Ah, right. Okay. Thanks very much. Right. Have we got any more questions, Abraham? Yeah. Where an alternative to plywood is not available, what can we do to get certificated plywood?
Okay. Well, certificated plywood is widely available. So it's not a problem. There's a lot of certificated plywood out there. Actually, most of the stuff that comes in at the UK will be certified to one of the two schemes. So it's not an issue. All I'm saying is there is an issue that there will be some uncertified material that may get into the UK. It's unlikely that will be from an illegal source because of the UK timber regulations that we mentioned and the due diligence processes that are required around that to make sure that the timber. So there's lots of checks on timber coming into the UK. So it's very unlikely you're going to get illegal timber now coming into the UK. But if you do need to use plywood, I'm not saying don't use plywood at all. All I'm saying is that, you know, with the restrictions on supply, it might be good to look at alternatives for particularly around birch ply, for example. And just make sure that it comes with one of those certification schemes, FSC or PFC in the main, because you won't find Granny Britain plywood because we don't make it in the UK, but you will find plywood with PFC or FSC certification widely available.
Okay, thanks very much, Charles. I actually think that's the last question. So if anyone does have another question before we go, please put it in. But I'm going to thank you, Charles, for your kind of giving your time to come along today. And I'm going to remind everyone, 20th of May, we'll be looking at the circular economy in timber. So I'm looking forward to that. Next week, well, let's look at, if anyone wants a certificate of attendance for today, they can do that by going to MyProPass. A number of you, I'm sure, who attend regularly probably do this. But if you want to, go to www.mypropass.co.uk. Do we have a slide for next week? Yep. Building Minds, the ESG platform with a plus. Find a solution that can accelerate the achievement of your decarbonisation targets. How to go all the way from data collection to translating decarbonisation targets into action plans. To register for that, you can go straight away to leadersmeets.com, and we look forward to seeing you. Just to remind you, and let's put it up, we do have now a feedback survey, which I would ask if you could just please take a couple of minutes to go through. In fact, if I can encourage you now, we could do it all together before we leave. So let's just put it up and we'll run through it. So let's force people down the line here. This session held my interest. So simply just choose the number of stars. If it held your interest, you can go all the way up to 10. So let's do that. Question 2, I was encouraged to participate. Participation is 2 ways, by poll or by questions. If you have another question, get it in quick. The content was pertinent and relevant to my role and my work. And next question, I will recommend others who did not attend this session to watch the recording. And you can go and watch that recording from later on this afternoon and certainly from Monday morning on leadersmeets.com. And there's 2 open questions here. If you think this session could be improved, please let us know how that might be. And Secondly, open question. Are there any other comments you would like to add? All I'd like to do is once again, thanks, Charles, and wish you all a very happy weekend.
Thanks for
you
the opportunity.
attending. Yep. Thank you, Charles. And we'll hope to see you next week.
Yep.
Many thanks. Have a great weekend. Bye. Thank you, Charles.
Thanks.